Bloodborne isn't just one of my favourite works of horror fiction, it's one of the best horror stories ever told in any medium. It's a game that doesn't just use horror as a mood or an aesthetic choice, but as a fundamental driving force of its narrative. And it's brilliant. Every design choice and environmental detail, every fragment of lore, every encounter is built around the slow, creeping realization that something is deeply, irreversibly wrong in Yharnam. It is also, in my opinion at least, From Software's greatest game, mechanically, narratively and thematically. It's the purest distillation of everything they do best. The speed and brutality of the combat, the cryptic puzzle box storytelling, the level design, and the way it takes player engagement for granted, rewarding those who dig deeper while still remaining a masterclass in atmosphere for those who don't. It is, simply put, a masterpiece. Bloodborne is also very much not for everyone. It is a descent into madness, in the truest sense, a spiral into a world of forgotten gods, tortured souls, and knowledge so terrible it literally makes your head burst. It begins as something familiar. A gothic horror tale of beasts and hunters, of streets slick with blood and cobblestones soaked in the stink of beasts. The deeper you go, though, the more the story warps to kaleidoscopic proportions. The more layers the nightmare unfolds, and by the time you reach its end, hopefully, you realize you were never truly the hunter in this story. You were the hunted all along. Like every project I start for YouTube at this point, this has turned into a pretty deep dive into Bloodborne's narrative. One day I'll do something nice and short and get it out in a reasonable time frame, I swear. Partly to mark its 10-year anniversary, but mostly, I think, because, if I'm being honest, it might just be my favourite game of all time. Now that's not hyperbole, and I don't say that lightly. My first journey through Yharnam was almost 10 years ago to the day of this video going live, and it's an honour to be able to revisit it now that I'm older and my skills are duller, rusted by time. If you're in for the long haul, I'd suggest thinking of this like a 5-part mini-series, with each episode peeling back another layer of the nightmare. Maybe take a break here and there. Bloodborne isn't exactly a light-hearted journey, and staring into the abyss for too long can get a little heavy. I've been actively writing this script since at least December, but a vague outline has been in my head for a long time now. It's taken on a few different forms over that time, and I've tentatively settled on experimenting with a more storybook style of analysis, trying to sharpen my storytelling and prose, so I hope you enjoy the ride, and hopefully I've balanced my terrible attempt at prose with enough game analysis to be interesting. So, with all that in mind, if you're ready, take a deep dive with me into the madness of Yharnam. We'll explore its layered, cryptic narrative, the history of the healing church, the terrors of the nightmare, and the fate of those who sought to transcend humanity, only to be consumed by something they should never have tampered with in the first place. Bloodborne is, at its heart, a game about curiosity, about what happens when you seek the truth, poke at the abyss, and maybe don't like what you find. Yharnam is a Victorian fever dream, like someone took London at its smoggiest, steeped it in blood and left it to rot under a sky that never quite reaches daylight. From the moment you step onto its rain-slicked cobblestones, you know something is wrong. The city doesn't just look haunted, it feels haunted, in a way I'm struggling to describe really. Like it remembers every terrible thing that's ever happened here. The gas lamp-lit alleys, the towering, oppressive Gothic architecture, the distant toll of a church bell. Yharnam's design does such a wonderful job of setting up the horror atmosphere from the get-go. Your journey kicks off in Yusefka's clinic, a cold, sterile little room where you wake up on an operating table, fresh off a mysterious blood transfusion. But this isn't just some throwaway intro sequence. It's more like a baptism. dunking you headfirst into a world where life and death are a cycle, a brutal, never-ending loop. Standing over you is the Blood Minister, this eerie, soft-spoken figure who offers you a deal you don't really get to refuse. His contract is more than just flavor. It's the game's way of handling you the mantle of the Hunter, a fate sealed the moment you hit confirm on the character creation screen. I guess it's a bit like Skyrim's cart ride, except instead of rolling up to Helgen for a date with the Executioner's axe, you're being ushered into something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than you can possibly comprehend. FromSoft have been so good at marrying gameplay with in-game lore and storytelling moments, and it's no different in Bloodborne. Mechanics and narrative are working together from the get-go so smoothly that you don't even notice that the trap is closing in around you. FromSoft games have always been known for their cryptic storytelling, but Bloodborne, I think, takes it to another level. The only real clue you get at the start of the game is a single, hastily scribbled note. Seek pale blood to transcend the hunt. And what does that even mean? Pale blood, transcend the hunt? It means nothing. If it's your first time playing, at least. I know I completely overlooked it back then. It was just another vague, atmospheric detail in a game full of them. It certainly didn't help that you're soon being told that you just need to get out there and slay some beasts. But coming back with a better understanding of the world, I think you start to realize just how much weight that little note actually carries. It's the only real hint the game gives you on how to achieve the secret ending, of course. It's a perfect example of how Bloodborne rewards that curiosity and deeper engagement, tying right into its central themes of gaining insight, both literally as a game mechanic and figuratively as a descent into the cosmic horror. Speaking of tradition in FromSoft games, your first real encounter is, again, designed to kill you. A welcome to the game, enjoy getting stomped moment that sets the tone right out of the gate. But here, it's more than just a gameplay introduction, it's the game's first real horror beat. You step into a dimly lit clinical room, walls lined with vials and surgical instruments, overturned tables littering the floor. The air is thick with the sound of something wet. A deep, guttural growl, a sickening slurp, and then you see it. A monstrous wolf, hunched over an unseen victim, blood splattered in every direction. For a brief, desperate moment, you hope maybe it hasn't noticed you. Maybe you can sneak past. Maybe you could fight. But you don't even have a weapon yet. When it finally turns, you already know how this ends. You take a swing with your bare fists. It does nothing. A single swipe of its claws nearly kills you outright. The second finishes the job. You died. That infamous message flashes on screen, a taunting omen of things to come. If you're a Souls veteran, it's familiar. If you're not, well, you'll be seeing a lot of it. Here's something I find at least a little interesting. Unlike other FromSoft games, your first scripted death doesn't come at the hands of some towering demon or ancient monstrosity. No Vanguard or Asylum demon, no grafted scion, just a regular enemy. A beast. The kind you'll be facing all throughout Yharnam. Right away, I think the game does a great job of instilling a sense of fear, not just of the unknown, but of the familiar, of the creatures that lurk in the streets just beyond the clinic doors. But instead of respawning back where you started, you wake up somewhere else entirely. The Hunter's Dream. A graveyard stretching into infinity, massive stone pillars vanishing into the misty void. In the distance, a Gothic workshop stands, its warm lantern light beckoning you closer. This will be your refuge, your purgatory. And it's here that you finally get the tools of the hunt. A choice between the threaded cane, the hunter's axe, or the brutal saw cleaver, along with either a pistol or a blunderbuss for your offhand. It's also where you meet Gehrman, an old man in a wheelchair who offers you some vague, cryptic guidance.
You're sure to be in a fine haze about now, but Don't think too hard about all of this.
Listen here, Gehrman. Alright, here we overthink things to the extreme. I overthink things you haven't even thought of yet. Just take a look at the runtime in the corner of the screen. You think I got that by accepting happiness and accepting the philosophy of not thinking too hard about all this? Well, I guess you heard him. Time to get back to the hunt. As you stagger out of the clinic, the city greets you with a visceral, sensory overload. The labyrinthine streets of Yharnam are littered with the remnants of a once ordinary society. Prams and carriages left abandoned in the street, signs of a sudden disappearance. More menacing are the chained coffins that provoke a silent query into their mysterious restraints. Each element is meticulously placed to evoke an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia and despair. This is a living nightmare, and Yharnam's inhabitants have fallen victim to it, long before you arrived. Even the ambient sounds contribute to the dread as you walk through Yharnam. A blood-curdling screech echoes from unseen depths, while furtive knocks on creaking doors are met with hostile, deranged laughter. A visceral reminder that trust is a luxury in these forsaken streets. The citizens you encounter are themselves tragic figures, once human souls now reshaped into feral, rag-clad creatures wielding pitchforks and torches, their features contorted by the cursed blood that courses through their veins. They are not natural enemies. They're scared and they're angry. They scream at you to leave, some even blame you. As if some distant part of them still understands the horror of what they've become. They aren't villains, but they're what's left of a civilization that bled itself dry. Then comes my favourite early moment, the first moment of true spectacle, I think. You find yourself drawn to a congregation of these infected souls, all gathered around a blazing pyre. The flames cast eerie shadows over a creature whose identity is shrouded in mystery, leaving you with more questions than answers. We've seen one werewolf, yes, but this thing is so much larger. It's a scene that encapsulates the essence of Bloodborne's narrative. Every detail, every flicker of flame is a fragment of a larger, horrifying puzzle that beckons you deeper into the abyss. And yet, for all its oppressive gloom, Bloodborne dares you to fight back. Its combat isn't just fast, it's aggressive, demanding a kind of violent grace. Every swing, every dodge, every well-timed shot is a part of a brutal dance, one where hesitation means death. Take the threaded cane, easily my favourite of the starting weapons, for example. In its standard form, it's a precise, elegant, dueling blade, perfect for those one-on-one encounters. But with a flick of the wrist, or a tap of the cane on the floor, it unfurls into a deadly, serrated whip, carving through crowds and tearing into beasts with a vicious efficiency. It's Bloodborne's world in microcosm, beauty and brutality, sophistication and savagery, all tangled together in something that shouldn't work, but it absolutely does. Every time I start a new playthrough, I tell myself, this time, pick something different. Strength, arcane, anything but skill, or, to mix things up occasionally, skill and blood tinge. And yet, I always come back, every single time. The offhand gun isn't really there to provide cover from afar as you'd assume. It's a tool designed for close quarters disruption, an offense-only replacement for the Souls series' own parry mechanic, and a symbol of the relentless offense required to survive in Yharnam. Put down the shield, you won't need it here. Only the gun will see you through. Even the rally mechanic, allowing you to claw back lost health in the heat of battle, reinforces this unyielding, just keep swinging, aggressive mentality. You are an outsider here, thrust into a world where everything from the discarded wheelchairs and broken wagons to the ominously flickering gas lanterns conspire to keep you on edge, reminding you of that fact constantly. As I say, Bloodborne quickly becomes more than just a game. It's an invitation to embrace the terror, to wander those twisting alleys with wary steps, and to slowly, painstakingly, uncover the hidden monstrous truths lurking beneath the surface of Yharnam. By the time you stagger into the graveyard, where Father Gascoigne waits, you've probably started to feel desensitized. Well, as much as you can be, at least, by the brutality of Bloodborne. You've hacked and slashed your way through Yharnam's tight streets, its fetid sewers, its maddened citizens, each encounter reinforcing your role as the hunter, as the aggressor. And then you step into the clearing, and the game introduces you to something entirely different. Gascoigne isn't just another beast, another mindless wretch to be put down. He is unmistakably a hunter, much like yourself. The graveyard where he stands is shrouded in eerie quiet, the air thick with mist and death, framed by ominous trees and crumbling headstones. He is tall, imposing, his long hunter's coat stained with the telltale stink of the beast curse. The almost missable details highlight that his garb looks strikingly similar to your own, a warped reflection of where you might be heading. He wields the same weapons available to you, the same hunter's axe, the same blunderbuss you were offered by those horrible little messengers in the dream. In the instant you interrupt his frenzy, you catch him hacking at something on the ground, his strikes savage and merciless. The victim is obscured, but it doesn't matter. You already know it's the corpse of some unfortunate Yharnamite. Maybe one of the people you passed on your way here. Maybe someone who pleaded through a locked door for help. And then he speaks. A guttural, low growl.
Beasts all over the shop. You'll be one of them, sooner or later.
This line, this simple guttural warning, does so much heavy lifting. It tells us Gascoigne no longer sees a difference between hunter and beast. He has been on the hunt for so long that his instincts have overridden his reason. The blood, the madness, the violence, it has consumed him entirely. And if you're paying attention, you'll realize that you too have been doing exactly what he's doing. Cutting down anything in your path, letting the blood soak into your clothes. Gascoigne is what happens when the hunt goes on too long. Then he attacks. The first phase of the fight is a brutal test of everything you've learned so far. Gascoigne fights with the same techniques and tools you have, his axe shifting between a compact, fast-moving form and a sweeping, monstrous cleaver. He fires his blunderbuss at mid-range, punishing reckless aggression, just like you might have learned to do against the mobs of Yharnam. It's a duel in the truest sense. Fast, aggressive, and merciless, with both combatants darting between gravestones, using the environment for cover, finding openings where they can. The game is teaching you something crucial here. Gascoigne isn't just a boss, he's a mirror. You are fighting the best version of yourself. This is what you need to become in order to succeed. But then, at half health, the illusion of humanity shatters. Gascoigne lets out that guttural howl, his body writhes, twists and breaks, and suddenly he is no longer a hunter at all. He succumbs to the blood that has been eating away at him and transforms into a hulking feral beast. The speed, the precision, the skill of the first phase is gone, replaced with raw, unrelenting savagery. The environment that once gave you cover now crumbles under his strength. He tears through gravestones, crushing the space between you with terrifying efficiency. It's a desperate, violent shift, and yet, even now, the mechanics still reinforce the lesson. The same tactics that worked before, the same hunter's instincts, can still carry you through. A well-timed gunshot can still stagger him. A moment of bravery can still turn the tide in your favor. And then, finally, he falls. So, Bloodborne here presents a world steeped in nightmare and transformation, where the fear of losing one's humanity is both a narrative and mechanical reality. The first half of the game fixates on the plague of beasthood consuming Yharnam, a disease that strips men of their civility, their intellect, their very identity, leaving only feral creatures in their place. It's a horror deeply rooted in Victorian anxieties, particularly those around masculinity, strength, self-reliance, physical dominance, all things prized in that era. But Bloodborne, much like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, takes those ideals to their logical extreme and shows just how monstrous they can become. The tragedy of Father Gascoigne, I think, lays this bare. A man meant to protect his family, consumed by his own brutality. And all of it ties back to blood. The very thing that gives men power is also what destroys them in this world. As Provost Willem warns,
"We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open. Fear the old blood."
Bloodborne's Victorian setting reinforces this theme. The era was obsessed with refinement, self-control and reason, qualities that supposedly separated man from beast. But the game subverts that idea, suggesting that beneath all that polish, something savage is lurking, barely restrained. The beast plague doesn't just turn men into monsters, it exposes what was already there. The church hunters, once defenders of order, have become indistinguishable from the creatures they hunt, lost in their own bloodlust. Here, masculinity isn't a symbol of control, it's fragile, volatile, and always on the edge of collapsing into violence. As I say, Father Gascoigne serves as one of the most poignant examples of this theme. A former hunter who has succumbed to the plague, Gascoigne embodies the horror of a man who has lost all self-restraint. His transformation is not merely physical, but psychological too. His bestial rage leads him to slaughter his wife and abandon his children, leaving his daughters to fend for themselves in a dying city. You can encounter one of his daughters, who gives you a music box that once soothes Gascoigne's mind, a symbol of the fragile ties to his former humanity. During the boss fight, playing the music box momentarily stuns him, forcing a flicker of recognition, a tragic moment where the man resurfaces briefly before the beast takes hold once more. This confrontation is a brutal indictment of the traditional notions of masculine strength and power. It is not noble nor heroic, but tragic and ruinous. Although beasthood in Bloodborne isn't just about turning into a monster. It's a story about addiction, excess, and the way chasing power can destroy you. The intoxicating nature of blood is emphasized throughout the game. Yharnam itself has abandoned alcohol, its people instead partaking in the consumption of blood as a pastime, a society ravaged by addiction. The healing church administers blood as both a miracle cure and a means of control. Hunters too are not immune. Those who indulge too deeply in the blood become blood drunk, a state from which there is no return. Gascoigne, who has clearly consumed too much, is not just another victim of the beast plague, he is a victim of addiction, of excess, of the belief that more strength, more power will keep him in control when, in reality, it only hastens his downfall. The imagery of the early game supports this thematic way, I think. The streets of Yharnam are filled with men who have turned into hideous, fur-covered monstrosities, yet they still retain echoes of their former lives, muttering half-remembered words, dragging tools as weapons, wearing tattered remnants of their old clothes. They're not fully alien, and that is, I think, what makes them so terrifying. They are the dark mirror, reflecting what lies beneath the thin veneer of civilization. Really, the first half of the game is all about this idea. It encourages you to fight harder, to enjoy the thrill of the hunt, but at the same time, it makes you wonder, isn't all this a little disturbing? Then, halfway through, the horror shifts. It stops being about beasts and blood. It becomes something deeper, stranger, something tied to nightmares and the unknown, but we'll get to that. Gascoigne is in many ways the perfect introduction to one of Bloodborne's two major boss archetypes. He is the first of many hunter fights, encounters that pit the player against others just like themselves, other hunters who have lost their way. These battles serve as the grim warning, the glimpse at the inevitable fate of those who hunt for too long, those who drink too deeply of the blood. The other kind of boss we meet, the towering beasts and the eldritch nightmares, well, those will come soon enough. But for now, the graveyard is quiet again. Night descends, the hunt continues, and the question lingers. How long until you lose yourself to the blood? Until somebody who mimics the soul you used to be comes along to strike you down, too. By the time you step into the cathedral ward, you might think you have a handle on what Bloodborne is. Yharnam has been a city of filth, of tight, cobbled streets where disease and madness run unchecked. You fought through its gutters, cut down its beast-ridden citizens, and maybe even started to believe that this is just a city lost to lycanthropy. An outbreak of werewolves gone terribly wrong. But stepping into the cathedral ward signals a first shift in the narrative. Here, religious iconography dominates, thick and suffocating, like the heavy incense that might once have filled these halls. The streets leading to the Grand Cathedral are lined with statues, but not of the familiar and expected saints and martyrs. These figures are mutated, their heads bulbous and malformed, stretched into distorted, alien shapes. At first glance, they might read as crude attempts at Gothic religious art, but if you look closely, you begin to feel disturbed. They look wrong. Off. And that's Bloodborne's first real hint, that there's something bigger at play here than an unfortunate plague of drunken, hairy football hooliganism. Inside the Grand Cathedral itself, the feeling of unease only deepens. It is an opulent space, lined with gold and grandiosity, a physical manifestation of the healing church's wealth and influence. This is where the power in Yharnam is seated, the place where blood ministration, the city's miracle cure, has been honed into ritual, and at its center, now, a lone figure kneels in prayer. Vicar Amelia is a fragile thing. Draped in ceremonial robes, clutching a small golden pendant, as if it were the last tether to humanity. This is another moment where Bloodborne's environmental storytelling shines. We don't know exactly who she is, but we can infer everything we need to. The pendant suggests she is someone of faith, someone deeply enmeshed in the healing church's doctrine, someone who believes in the sacred power of the blood. Maybe she's praying for some divine intervention, somewhat aware of what's about to happen. But as the player approaches, that faith's reward is unveiled. The transformation is one of the most terrifying in the game. The camera obscures much of it, forcing the player to see Amelia's change in brief, violent glimpses. Claws sprouting, fabric tearing, bones cracking, blood splattering against the walls as her body disfigures into something unrecognizable. The process is slow, drawn out, agonizing, and above all, tragic. When the transformation finally completes, the frail vicar is gone, replaced by a towering bestial monstrosity. The elegance of her former self is still there, though. Her long, flowing fur drapes like an ethereal, tattered gown, and her antlered silhouette evokes something both sacred and profane. The line between beauty and horror, between divinity and monstrosity, is razor thin here. And then the fight begins. If Gascoigne was a duel, a test of skill against an enemy who mirrors your own, then Vicar Amelia is something else entirely. She is raw, feral power, all-sweeping cause and crushing mass, a beast that uses its sheer size to overwhelm. Here, the game reinforces a crucial lesson. Aggression is survival here. Your instinct might be to keep distant, to weave away from Amelia's devastating swipes, but the best strategy is to stay close, to dodge beneath her claws, to carve into her before she can react. It's counterintuitive, and that's what makes it work. This is the second archetype of Bloodborne's boss fights, the grand, terrifying creatures that remind the player just how small they are. And yet, despite the scale, despite the violence, the sadness never leaves the encounter. Amelia does not roar in rage, she howls in pain. When she takes damage, she clutches at that small golden pendant, as if some distant, fading part of her still believes it can save her. She isn't a mindless monster. She is something that used to be human, something that is still sentient and aware, on some level, of what she has become. She is grieving for herself. This again is Bloodborne's brilliance in microcosm. The game never just wants to scare you. It wants you to feel something, to question what you're doing. Because when the fight is over, when Amelia lies dead and the player stands drenched in her blood, the game doesn't pat you on the back. It doesn't tell you that you did the right thing. Instead, it makes you sit in the quiet of your victory. The Grand Cathedral, once a holy place, is now desecrated by violence, by blood. The act of the hunt, of slaying these things that were once people, is not a triumphant act. The statues outside, the whispers of otherworldly forces, the way the blood itself, so revered and so sacred, seems to be the very thing damning the city. The healing church, the ones who should have been shepherding Yharnam towards salvation, are complicit in its destruction. At this early stage, we can't know how far that goes, but you can feel it. The atmosphere is so good. And you, the player, are complicit too. Every boss you slay, every creature you cut down, every drop of blood spilled, it is all leading somewhere. Where exactly? That's the real horror of Bloodborne. And it's only just beginning. If the healing church is the city's pulsing, corrupted heart, and believe me, we'll be looking at how dark the church's actions get in part 3, then Byrgenwerth is the severed nerve. Long since abandoned, but still thrumming with significance. To even reach it, the player must first grasp a fundamental truth hidden within the Grand Cathedral. That foreboding phrase, fear the old blood. We already talked about this phrase a little earlier, but let's return to it and dig a little deeper. This adage, spoken between two spectral figures in a vision granted by touching the deformed skull at the cathedral's altar, is more than a warning, I think. It is the first explicit acknowledgement of the split that fractured the healing church. Here, Master Willem, the enigmatic provost of Byrgenwerth, is seen conversing with Lawrence, the eventual founder of the church. Willem cautions restraint, advocating a path of knowledge rather than indulgence, but Lawrence, ever the ambitious acolyte, rejects him. Lawrence may not have feared the old blood, but by the time we meet him, long after this conversation has passed into memory, his fate will prove that perhaps he should have. Well, if the healing church is the heir to Byrgenwerth's discoveries, then the Forbidden Woods are the consequences nobody wanted to deal with. The church didn't declare this place off limits out of some noble desire to protect the people of Yharnam. It did so to silence the ones left behind, the ones still clinging to truths the Church would rather erase. They took Byrgenwerth's findings, discarded its warnings, and left Willem and his followers to rot in obscurity. The woods themselves reflect this secrecy. Unlike the claustrophobic streets of Yharnam, here the world feels open, but not in a way that grants freedom. This certainly isn't the open world of Elden Ring. Rather, it smothers. The tangled branches and thick canopy pressing in on all sides. It's claustrophobic and suffocating. The moonlight struggles to reach the ground through a network of gnarled roots and skeletal trees, and the land is infested with slithering masses of coiled serpents. In the bodies of former villagers, the infection takes on a disgusting new appearance. Parasitic snakes burst from their skulls, writhing and puppeteering the bodies they have overtaken. Here, the horror of losing oneself, a recurring theme in Bloodborne, is given a sickening new form. The people of these woods are infested, their identities consumed by something deeper, more insidious than mere lycanthropy. Within the Forbidden Woods, the serpent imagery is rich. My first few playthroughs I thought, it's an odd detail to transition from the wolves and beasts of the city streets to the snakes of the woods. Why does it always have to be snakes? Me being me and the overthinker that I am, well, I needed to look deeper, so bear with me. At first glance, the snakes in the game serve as straightforward enemies, right? Parasitic creatures that coil and writhe, consuming the bodies of hapless villagers. They're creepy. They fit the aesthetic of the area, and they give us a nice little bit of variety to the enemy roster. They are an obvious force of corruption. But as with most things in Bloodborne, a deeper dive into the symbolism reveals a more nuanced reading. Snakes have often been associated with evil, largely due to their presence in Judeo-Christian mythology. The serpent in the Garden of Eden is the quintessential deceiver, the bringer of knowledge that humanity was not meant to have, and ultimately the catalyst for the fall. In Bloodborne, the Forbidden Woods and Byrgenwerth at its center function as a similar kind of space, a threshold between the player's familiar world and the deeper, more esoteric horrors that lie beyond. The snake-infested woods lead directly to Byrgenwerth, after all, the seat of knowledge of the Great Ones. But, snakes do not only symbolize deception and corruption. Across many cultures, they also represent renewal and rebirth. Their ability to shed their skin has long been a metaphor for transformation, and in Bloodborne, transformation, both gruesome and sublime, is a recurring motif. Many of the game's enemies are in various stages of mutation, their bodies betraying the influence of gaining wisdom. The serpent-ridden villagers and the horrific snake-headed creatures found deeper in the woods feel like a darkened version of this transformation motif, their forms shifting into something beyond human comprehension. The Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, is a particularly resonant image, I think, when considering Bloodborne's themes. It is a symbol of infinity, the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth, a motif that permeates the game's lore and most of From's catalogue. But the Ouroboros is also a sign of caution. An endless cycle can also be a prison. The people of the Forbidden Woods, not to mention Yharnam, and even the player caught in the Hunter's Dream, are caught in an endless loop of mutation and decay. Their bodies no longer entirely their own, their very flesh consumed by the serpents and beasts that writhe within them. Beyond transformation, snakes are also often guardians. In myth, they serve as protectors of sacred sites, coiled around trees of life, guarding knowledge and standing sentinel at the edges of the divine. The serpents in Bloodborne mirror this function, albeit in that corrupted form that we should be used to by now. They are not simply there as monstrous obstacles for the player, they're that perversion of the idea of a divine guardian that protects the pursuit of learning. Their presence suggests that the path ahead is not meant for ordinary humans, that the knowledge of Byrgenwerth is dangerous, that those who seek it may not emerge unscathed. Beyond all this talk of metaphor, though, snakes are simply unsettling. Their movement is unnatural, their presence often unseen until it's too late, and they hit a very primal fear response, or at least they do in me. Unlike the beasts in Yharnam, which are loud, aggressive, and obvious in their threat, the serpents in the woods feel insidious. They slither through the undergrowth, emerge from the ground, and always seem to multiply. Their presence makes the woods feel oppressive, labyrinthine, and unknowable. And they perfectly raise the player's pulse before the area's boss fight. The last line of defense before Byrgenwerth itself is a trio of imposing figures, the shadows of Yharnam. Cloaked in darkness, their forms evoke the spectral menace of the Nazgul from Lord of the Rings. Where the ringwraiths are seekers, the shadows are silent sentinels. They are the secret keepers, the Church's last enforcers against those who would dare to reach Byrgenwerth and the truth it holds. The fight itself is a brutal test of spacing and control. It's easy to get overwhelmed by their mix of sword strikes and that relentless pyromancy. The misty graveyard setting is incredibly menacing and useful. A massive tombstone sits in the middle of the arena, acting as both a visual barrier and a temporary refuge, a way to separate the three of them just long enough to make a plan. Each shadow has their own health bar, which means you need to focus them down one at a time. It's got shades of the Ornstein and Smaug fight from Dark Souls, the kind of battle where positioning is everything, and the more chaotic it gets, the worse your odds become. Each time one falls, the other two are empowered. The shadows reveal serpent-like appendages that stretch the range of their sword strikes. Of course they also hide snakes under their cloaks. It is a pretty unrelenting trial, and your survival here is a rite of passage. An initiation into the next layer of Bloodborne's nightmare. Finally, we reach Byrgenwerth itself. For a place that holds such weight in Yharnam's history, Byrgenwerth is almost disappointingly small. But that is, I think, deliberate. This is, after all, not a thriving institution. It is a relic frozen in time. The architecture speaks to old academic grandeur, the classic image of a British Russell Group university. Think Oxford, Cambridge, York, lost to the ages. And beyond it, a lake, vast, motionless, illuminated by a moon that feels too full, too low. There is something unnatural about it all, something that suggests the laws of nature are slipping. The world itself is bending, whispering that this place, this lake, is no ordinary body of water. Inside the university, the air is thick with dust, the remnants of research left to stagnate, its walls lined with tomes and curios of unknowable origin. Notes left behind offer cryptic warnings, and one stands out among them. The spider hides all manner of rituals, certain to reveal nothing, for true enlightenment need not be shared. A reminder that whatever secrets Byrgenwerth once uncovered, they are not meant for all. Knowledge in this world is not a gift. It is a curse, a burden that bends the mind beyond recognition. But the scholars of Byrgenwerth were not the only ones who sought enlightenment. A lone figure waits within the halls, a ranking member of the choir, an elite sect of the healing church, sent here probably not to learn, but to suppress. The choir knows what Byrgenwerth discovered, and they know it cannot be allowed to spread. This figure, wielding a threaded cane and arcane magic, is proof that the Healing Church has not forgotten its origins. It merely seeks to ensure they're never uncovered. But the true revelation comes outside, on the balcony overlooking the Great Lake. There, in the pale glow of the unnatural moon, sits Master Willem. He does not fight, he doesn't speak even. He simply points toward the lake. Honestly, it's kind of an anticlimax. This is the guy who led Byrgenwerth, the guy who started all of this. And I've got questions. So many questions. But Willem just sits there, rocking slowly, silent, offering nothing but that one simple gesture. It's frustrating. But it's also perfect, because at this point, Bloodborne isn't interested in giving you all the answers. It's pointing you towards something bigger, something you're just supposed to see for yourself. He has, after all, been here for years, perhaps decades, watching the lake, waiting for the one who will see what he saw. He does not resist when the player approaches, and he doesn't seek to protect what he has learned. He simply waits. And the player, if they've been paying attention, understands what they must do. Or, if you're like I was 10 years ago, you probably wandered around the university grounds for ages wondering, where is it you want me to go next, game? But, of course, time is knowledge. The lake is more than a lake. It is a veil, a boundary, and to cross it, one must make a leap of faith. Master Willem, the man who rejected blood and sought knowledge, does not move, does not resist as the player steps towards that edge, and as they gaze into the abyss, as they open their minds to what lies beyond the water's surface, the final threshold is crossed. The truth is waiting. And it is so much worse than anything the player has seen before. Bloodborne presents a deeply ambivalent perspective on knowledge. It is both a path to enlightenment and a gateway to horror, a paradox where revelation and destruction are intertwined. You need at least some insight to even start leveling up in this game, something unique to Bloodborne. Knowledge is very literally here power, something you must earn. The game does not offer a simple answer to whether the pursuit of knowledge is inherently destructive or if only certain knowledge is forbidden. It simply presents the consequences and asks you, the player, to grapple with them. In fact, let's take a little second to talk about insight. The game's most explicit numerical mechanic tied to the idea of knowledge is insight, a resource that represents awareness of the sinister truths lurking beneath Yharnam's facade. As you gain insight, the world itself changes. The inanimate becomes animate. The doll in the hunter's dream remains lifeless until you gather your first glimpse of insight, by at least finding either the cleric beast or Gascoigne. Only then, when you've slaughtered your first prey or been sent back to the dream with your tail between your legs, does she awaken to guide you and offer her leveling abilities. More chillingly, through growing insight, the true nature of Yharnam's horror is revealed. Creatures that were once invisible become grotesquely apparent. Most notably, of course, the amygdala. Enormous eldritch beings that cling to Yharnam's cathedrals like parasites, unnoticed by those still blind to the deeper reality. It's fun the first time you leave Cathedral Ward and are grabbed and killed by a random blue light, only to realize hours later this thing was responsible. Knowledge, too, is clarity in Bloodborne. Once the player understands the true nature of Yharnam's curse, they literally see more of the world. But that knowledge also carries a price. At certain insight thresholds, enemies literally become stronger. Their attack patterns shift and madness becomes more prevalent. The lanterns carried by the church servants, for example, gain these bulbous eyes covering the lens, firing beams of cosmic power. The higher your insight, the lower your resistance to frenzy buildup is. In this way, I guess the game is telling you that revelation and ruin are one and the same. The narrative and gameplay mechanics reinforce one another constantly. Man, Bloodborne is just so good. Anyway, back to Byrgenwerth. So the scholars of Byrgenwerth sought truth in the ancient tombs beneath Yharnam, excavating knowledge from a civilization long gone. But what they found was not meant for human minds. Their fate is one of erasure. By the time the player arrives, the university is a husk, abandoned save for Willem, who sits in his chair, his mind seemingly shattered by what he has learned. What exactly happened at Byrgenwerth? The game implies that their experiments led to contact with the Great Ones. Beings of incomprehensible cosmic intelligence, Willem, in his wisdom, feared the use of the old blood, recognizing it as a path to corruption rather than true enlightenment. But others, Lawrence and his healing church, believed otherwise. This divide is the very schism that shaped Yharnam's fate. I don't think Willem is painted as a villain, but he is very much also not victorious. He sought truth, but found himself powerless in the face of it. He rejected the temptation of blood, yet he still sits motionless, staring endlessly into the lake, waiting for someone who might succeed where he failed. If Byrgenwerth was destroyed by knowledge, then the healing church is what happens when knowledge isn't just embraced, it's exploited, repackaged and sold to the masses. They didn't warn people about the dangers of the eldritch, they bottled it up and called it salvation. No side effects may include warning on the label here. They took the power of the Great Ones and turned it into blood ministration, a miracle cure that made them the unquestioning rulers of Yharnam. And it makes sense, doesn't it? People turn to religion for comfort, for answers, for something bigger than themselves. And the healing church doesn't just offer faith, it offers results, tangible results. Their blood actually heals. When you're desperate, when you're suffering, you don't question a miracle, you embrace it. It's why cults work in the real world, why televangelists get rich, why blind faith is so dangerous. It reminds me a lot of Midnight Mass, a fantastic show that digs into these same ideas. Religious fervor, blood, transformation, and how belief, when left unchecked, can lead people straight to ruin. Later, we'll look at just how far the church is willing to go in pursuit of the divine, but even now the consequences are clear. They watched as Yharnam citizens twisted into beasts, as the city fell into madness, and instead of stopping, instead of admitting their mistake, they doubled down. They formed entire guilds of maniacs armed with deranged weapons to control the outbreak, to manage the horror. Anything but face the truth. Because, in their minds, the cost didn't matter, as long as they could touch something greater and remain unchanged themselves. Every beast clawing through the streets is a victim of the church's ambition. Every nightmare skulking in the dark is a monument to their arrogance. Where Byrgenwerth was wiped out for reaching too far, the healing church thrived for a time by embracing the abyss. But in doing so, they sealed the city's fate. So, maybe knowledge itself isn't the curse. Maybe it's hubris. Willem feared the blood, so he did nothing, and that didn't save him. Lawrence embraced it, and it doomed Yharnam. And you, the player, well, you walk a razor's edge between these extremes, chasing insight, hunting for answers, until, inevitably, you wade too deep into a nightmare you might never wake up from. Anyway, for now the player must, as Willem bids, dive now into the great lake behind Byrgenwerth. Its eeriness now makes sense, or as much sense as a game inherently about madness and cosmic horror can. The lake is some kind of cosmic illusion, a great, bright, white expanse of a lakebed seemingly stretching on into the infinite cosmos. a veil needing to be lifted by the player that has long kept the eldritch truth hidden. And at the center of this eerie lake, that Byrgenwerth spider, Rom. Hey, Editing Craig, chiming in for a second, just a quick heads up. This next section is all about Rom, which means there's going to be a lot of spider imagery. I can't really avoid it while discussing this next part of the game, so if you'd rather not see that, feel free to skip ahead to the interlude using the chapter select feature in the description of the video. Thanks. Rom, the vacuous spider, represents that turning point in Bloodborne I mentioned earlier, both narratively and thematically. Her death marks the moment when the game fully transitions from a primarily Victorian Gothic horror story about beasts and blood into a nightmare of cosmic terror. The hunt, which once felt like a grim struggle against werewolves and disease, is revealed to be something far more disturbing. The desperate writhing of a world teetering on the brink of revelation. Rom's presence in the Great Lake is what keeps the world of Yharnam blissfully ignorant. By defeating Rom, you inadvertently tear down the veil, exposing Yharnam to the truth. The great many-eyed amygdala, once invisible and now seen clinging to cathedral spires, looming over the city like parasites. The blood moon now hangs low in the sky, bathing Yharnam in its eerie crimson glow. The city is not merely sick, it is ensnared in the designs of unearthly gods. There is no hope of a cure now. This moment is irreversible. Where most games might frame a boss fight as a triumphant conquest, Rom's death is a mistake. A rupture in the world's fabric. The world isn't yours to fix, and you're not a hero. You're just another poor soul who, like the scholars of Byrgenwerth, reached too far without ever stopping to ask if you should. Rom is called vacuous, empty, thoughtless. A void where intelligence should be, and that's the cruel irony, isn't it? She represents the pursuit of enlightenment, but in reaching for it she found only blankness. If Mikolash's ravings are anything to go by, then she wasn't always like this. She was once human, or at least that's my interpretation, a scholar of Byrgenwerth who sought to transcend her limitations. Unlike Willem, who only dreamed of ascension, Rom actually achieved something. But, as you can see, the cost was pretty steep. Instead of true enlightenment, Rom became a vessel, a barrier, an unwitting gatekeeper preventing others from seeing the truth. Her only instinct seems to be preservation, and even that is not driven by will. She simply exists in her infinite lake, unthinking, unknowing, blindly holding back something of the tide of madness, a slave to higher powers. And when you kill her, you don't defeat some great cosmic intelligence, you simply remove the last fragile lock on a door that should have stayed shut. So, the battle against Rom is thematically appropriate, if mechanically frustrating. She does not attack at first, she doesn't even acknowledge your presence. She just exists, floating in her lake, passive and indifferent. It's only when you strike her first that she reacts. And even then, she doesn't lash out. She calls for help. She doesn't fight back in the way a beast or a hunter would, the way they have thus far in the game. In the first phase, she barely fights at all. She simply moves away, teleporting across the lake, stretching out her existence for as long as she can. It's pathetic. It's tragic. It makes you question what you're doing, which, of course, you should. Even when she finally retaliates in the later phases, her arcane attacks don't feel calculated or vengeful. They're impersonal, cosmic flares lashing out in random bursts, less like an act of malice and more like the inevitable, mindless forces of the universe at work. The real fight isn't really with Rom herself, despite what the health bar on the bottom of the screen might be teaching you. It's with the children of Rom, the swarm of skittering, disgusting, spider-like horrors that turn the battle into a pretty frustrating war of attrition. And this is where the fight becomes a choice. Do you focus on Rom and risk being overwhelmed? Or do you deal with her kin first, drawing out the encounter, giving her more time to get lucky with an arcane meteor strike? If I were being generous, I'd say it's a moment that reflects Bloodborne's deeper themes. The hunter is always choosing between facing the greater truth head-on or getting lost in the struggle along the way. Or maybe it's just an annoying fight. Who's to say? Anyway, Rom's demise is not just the end of a boss fight. It is the end of ignorance. The blood moon rises, an unmistakable omen of otherworldly interference. Queen Yharnam appears, weeping blood, a hint at the deeper nightmare that connects the Great Ones to human suffering, and then the city changes. Or rather, it stops pretending. The amygdala, once unseen, are suddenly everywhere, looming over the streets, their presence revealing that Yharnam has been infested all along. The horrors weren't waiting for you to uncover them, they were always there. You just couldn't see them. Now there's no veil of ignorance left to hide behind. Whatever comfort existed in not knowing is gone. This is where Bloodborne fully commits to its Lovecraftian roots. Up until now, there's been hints, but mostly it's been recognizable. Wolves, plagues, religious hypocrisy. But with Rom's death, the real enemy reveals itself. And it's not something you can just cut down with a trick weapon. Well, okay, you can, but thematically they, represent something bigger, something vast, something that doesn't care whether you understand it or not. By killing Rom, you've crossed the Rubicon. There's no going back. You wanted to know more, and now you're suffering the consequences. You're not that outsider looking in anymore. You're deep in the thick of it. And the worst part, you probably thought you'd be different, that you'd be the one to break the cycle, the hero who gets to walk this path without falling into the same traps. But Bloodborne was never just about surviving the night. It was about making you realize that the survival was never the goal to begin with. There's no going back to ignorance. The truth is out, and the hunt is far from over. Okay, I want to take a quick detour before we reach deeper into the nightmare of Bloodborne's second half. Cainhurst Castle is Bloodborne's love letter to the Gothic tradition, a haunted, frozen ruin steeped in tragedy, aristocratic decay, and unholy blood rituals. Unlike Yharnam's nightmarish urban sprawl, Cainhurst exists in eerie isolation, a place that time has long abandoned. It is an outlier within the game's otherwise Lovecraftian horror, invoking classic vampire mythology instead. Le Fanu's Carmilla, Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course, Nosferatu, and the vengeful spirits of Gothic ghost stories. On a first look, it doesn't really cleanly fit in with the otherwise razor-focused storytelling of the rest of Bloodborne. Yet, it remains thematically intertwined with Bloodborne's obsession with the blood, corruption, and the conflict between knowledge and faith. From the moment you step into the black, driverless carriage at the edge of Hemwick Carnal Lane, Cainhurst is presented as otherworldly. The carriage, emerging from the mist and opening its doors of its own accord, feels possessed. A spectral transport leading to a place outside the bounds of reality. The skeletal, frost-bitten horses that pull the carriage through the blizzard reinforce this sense of dreamlike inevitability. By the time the player arrives at Cainhurst, the horses have long since perished. as if they had been dead all along. The castle itself is an instant visual contrast to everything in Yharnam. The snow-covered courtyard, with its frozen fountain and dead, coiled trees, paints a picture of a place frozen in time. The bloated, blood-filled ticks crawling among the ruins hint at the Vileblood legacy, a court that once drank deep of forbidden blood, only to be mutated, slaughtered, and abandoned. Cainhurst is more than just a vampire's lair. It is a crime scene. The ghosts of noble women drift through its corridors, weeping and attacking the player with spectral daggers. They are not merely restless spirits. They are the vengeful victims, massacred in an act of holy extermination carried out by Logarius and his executioners. This was not a battle. This was a purge, a genocide under the guise of divine justice. According to Alfred, a devout executioner and discipline of Logarius, once a scholar betrayed his fellows at Byrgenwerth and brought forbidden blood back with him to Cainhurst Castle. It was there that the first of the inhuman Vilebloods was born. The Vilebloods are fiendish creatures who threaten the purity of the Church's blood healing. This single act, bringing forbidden blood to Cainhurst, resulted in the birth of a heretical bloodline, separate from the healing Church and with its own twisted aristocracy. Or at least, that's the story the Church wants us to believe. I'll leave a little pin in that thought for now. Anyway, in response to this heresy, Logarius led his executioners to wipe them out entirely. The massacre was so total that Cainhurst was left a forsaken ruin, its halls now filled only with ghosts, blood-drunk abominations, and Logarius himself, who, in his failure to completely eradicate the Vileblood line, chose to eternally seal the secret away rather than allow it to be uncovered. Logarius, once a righteous executioner, is now a withered, frost-bitten corpse, clutching his bladed scythe, seated atop Cainhurst rooftops as though he is the last king of a ruined kingdom, the image completed by the crown adorning his skull. The very title, Martyr, implies self-sacrifice, but his vigil has lasted too long. He's become something akin to an undead warden, guarding a truth he cannot unsee, even as time erodes his body. The fight against Logarius is a grueling battle against an opponent who embodies both fanaticism and regret. At times, he fights like the disciplined hunter you've come to expect, parryable, aggressive, but methodical. But for the most part, annoyingly, he abandons discipline for raw power, using spectral skulls and aerial attacks that suggest he has become something beyond human, perhaps even something akin to a Vileblood. His use of arcane blood magic is especially striking because of what we know of the Healing Church and their own use of magic. Theirs comes from the cosmos, the sky above. They pull eldritch tentacles from the void or cast a barrage of arcane orbs. They don't use this blood magic. Was he always capable of such sorcery, or has he, in his long vigil, unknowingly drawn from the very power he sought to destroy? The item description on the executioner's glove, the magic that most similarly resembles Logarius's, doesn't really clear things up for me either. One of the secret treasures hidden in Cainhurst, the gloves of an executioner from a faraway land, passed from executioner father to executioner son. These gloves can be used to summon wrathful spirits of the past by smearing them with blood. It is said that the nobles found immeasurable delight in the dances of these vengeful spectres. I think executioner here is a bit misleading, as the glove is from a faraway land and is a treasure of Cainhurst. It wouldn't make a lot of sense for this type of magic to belong to Logarius, as a sworn enemy of the Vilebloods of Cainhurst. Maybe I'm missing something here. Or maybe I just hate the magic spamming Logarius engages in during the boss fight, and I'm just looking for an excuse. Anyway, his most dangerous ability is his attempt to buff himself with a shield that makes him nearly impervious to stagger, forcing the player to interrupt him before it's too late. Whenever I revisit Bloodborne, I always, invariably, struggle with Logarius. He's always one of only a few bosses who really challenge me every single time I pick up the controller. Defeating Logarius and donning his crown of illusions reveals a truth that he sought to keep hidden. Queen Annalise of the Vilebloods still lives. Annalise, the last of the Cainhurst Vilebloods, sits upon her throne, untouched by time, immortal yet imprisoned. Unlike the beasts of Yharnam or the alien kin of the choir, she is something else, a queen who feeds upon blood, yet somehow retains her humanity. By bowing to her, the player can join the Cainhurst Vilebloods, swearing allegiance to a faction long considered heretical. Yet, despite all the legends, Annalise is not some great evil. She doesn't attack the player, nor does she rant and rave like a certain other character associated with this questline. She is dignified, composed, and quietly tragic. Her court is gone, her subjects are dead, but she still speaks with a practiced air of authority, and the one man who could have ended her existence instead chose to guard her away from the world rather than strike the final blow. The player can choose to invite Alfred to Cainhurst, unknowingly setting in motion his own personal revenge fantasy. Alfred, so devoted to the executioner's cause, will take up Logarius's unfinished mission, slaughtering Annalise in her throne room and reducing her to a pile of bloodied remains. His zealotry is so absolute that he takes his own life shortly after, having fulfilled his life's purpose. Is the blood itself the sin, or is the way it is wielded that which makes it dangerous? Who is truly monstrous, the Vileblood Queen or the church that sought to destroy her out of fear or control? The Vilebloods are said to be heretical, and yet Alfred's retribution is so over the top. It symbolizes, to me at least, the true villainy of the church in microcosm. And perhaps most tragically, did Logarius in the end fail his mission because he could not bring himself to kill Annalise? What makes Cainhurst so powerful as an optional area is its self-contained tragedy. Unlike other locations in Bloodborne, it is isolated from the Great Ones and the nightmare of the hunt. It is a human story, a tale of prejudice, obsession, and a war that ultimately left both sides in ruin. The ghosts of Cainhurst do not exist due to an interference of the sinister, the cosmic. They linger because their deaths were unjust, their royal lineage stamped out in the name of pious fanaticism. The architecture, so different. The turrets and buttresses and grand castle imagery is so archaic compared with Yharnam. The snow-covered ruins, the eternal sadness of Annalise's throne room, all of it paints a picture of a world left behind, where the grand ambitions of aristocrats and zealots alike have long since faded into irrelevance. As I said at the start of this chapter, Cainhurst does not seamlessly fit within Bloodborne's cosmic horror. It's an outlier, a relic from an older kind of horror fiction. Yet, that is exactly why it works so well in my opinion. It offers the player a different flavor of horror to that which they've been presented with previously, one which highlights human folly, the futility of vendettas, massacres, and the blind pursuit of righteousness. Okay, back to Yharnam. When we left off to explore Cainhurst, the blood moon had risen over Yharnam, triggered by the death of Rom, and the city had completely unraveled. Things were bad before, but now? Well, now the nightmare isn't just creeping in around the edges, it's fully here. With that, new paths have opened up through Yahar'gul, an unseen village that was previously partially accessible to explore under the guise of the Hypogean jail. But before we head too deep, I'd like to backtrack, secret key in hand, to the long-sealed Upper Cathedral Ward, an area you might have spotted in the distance earlier, but until now couldn't reach. Perched high above Yharnam, the Upper Cathedral Ward serves as the sanctum of the choir, an elite sect of the Healing Church. More than just devout clerics, the choir is an assembly of scholars, inheritors of the forbidden knowledge that once lay buried within the halls of Byrgenwerth. Their search for the divinity was not through prayer, nor through devotion, but through understanding, through study. Understanding that the cosmos was not distant, but intimately close, only just above our heads. This epiphany, inscribed upon the Cosmic Eye Watcher badge found in the Upper Cathedral Ward's orphanage, became the foundational motto of their pursuits. But their faith was not placed in the gods of mercy. Our own time in the Upper Cathedral Ward is less of an exploration and more of a slow, creeping realization of just how bad things really got. The place used to be a beacon of worship, but now it's smothered in darkness. Candles flicker feebly, barely holding back the gloom. The silence is heavy, except if you listen closely, it's not really all that silent at all. There's something beneath it, a whisper, distant chanting, the breath of something vast and unknowable. Slugs look to something, a congregation of mollusks lost in prayer. And at the center of it all is that orphanage. And thanks to the hunt the church itself started, it was probably always full, packed with children who had nowhere else to go after their parents disappeared. But, like a diabolical Dickens tale, this wasn't some kind-hearted refuge. It wasn't a home, it was a front. A laboratory. A place of suffering masquerading as sanctuary. And now it's dead silent. Well, except for the wells that lunge at you from the dark as you walk through the halls. See, the choir, those scholars at the top of the church's hierarchy, were obsessed with making contact with the Great Ones. They wanted a bridge, a vessel, something that could link humanity to the beings beyond. And in their eyes, who better to use for that purpose than the most vulnerable among them? Orphans, abandoned and forgotten, easy to take without question. In a city ravaged by the hunt, I imagine it probably wasn't all that hard to find children with no one left to protect them. So, one by one, they were reshaped, stripped of their humanity, piece by piece, until nothing was left but, well, whatever those sad little eldritch slugs are. If you had any lingering doubts that the Healing Church was up to some truly messed up stuff, here's your proof. And we're nowhere near done exploring the church's misdeeds. But what made them so desperate? What convinced them that the cosmos was close enough to reach, that all of this was worth it? The choir, along with the tomb prospectors working on their behalf, had uncovered something. Long ago, something ancient, something powerful. Deep in the ruins of an old tomb, buried beneath Yharnam in the labyrinths of Thumeru, they found her. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, a great one left behind. Her form is monstrous, an impossible thing, part slug, part cephalopod, part divine. Her flesh is torn and festering, her massive pale wings skeletal and broken. Fungoid growths split her face apart, revealing no true mouth, only raw, red, depthless flesh. She's horrific to look at, and yet I can't help but feel there is something deeply sad in her story. Ebrietas is One of the only actual, capital G great ones we ever get to see up close. One of the few humanity has ever truly made contact with. And, naturally, our first instinct was to stick her with needles and experiment on her. Because, of course we did. No wonder the rest of the Great Ones keep their distance. Unlike the others, whose motives range from cryptic to outright malicious, Ebrietas seems lost, abandoned. And yet, rather than lashing out at those who found her, she actually communed with the choir, guiding them in ways only they could understand. That's where Careth runes come in. Runesmith Careth, who was originally part of Byrgenwerth. Maybe the choir stole his work, or maybe they collaborated for a while, who knows. Somehow, he managed to transcribe the inhuman voices of the Great Ones into symbols that actually conveyed meaning of some sort. The whole thing kind of reminds me of how the aliens in Arrival communicated. A totally different way of conceptualizing language beyond human understanding. In Bloodborne, these runes aren't just for lore, though. Your character can literally carve them onto their brain to gain buffs. Personally, I tend to stack Clawmark, Blood Rapture, and Uden Writhe to boost my visceral parries, since I tend to always run a skill or blood tinge build. It's a fun setup, but it's completely useless here against Ebrietas. Either that or I just can't seem to land parries on her consistently. Anyway, willingly or not, Ebrietas gave the choir her blood. And, well, we all know how that went down. At first, it seemed like a miracle. It healed wounds, made people stronger, even extended life. Everyone in Yharnam was hooked, flocking to blood ministration like it was the best thing since sliced bread. If sliced bread also had the side effect of making you immortal. Honestly, the whole thing is basically just the plot of the Futurama Slurm Queen episode. You think you're getting something amazing, only to find it's coming out of something deeply messed up. Oh man, does anybody get the Slurm reference? Please, don't let it just be me. Anyway, where was I? Her miracle gifts were curses in disguise. Blood healing did not save Yharnam. As we know, it doomed it. And now the city drowned in its own sickness. And it all started here with Ebrietas. When the player finds her, she is not hostile. She's kneeling at the altar of despair, her massive, malformed body coiled in quiet mourning. Before her lies the corpse of something familiar. A being that looks an awful lot like Rom. Smaller, maybe. Did Ebrietas love this creature? Did she grieve its loss? Well, I don't know the answer to that. She doesn't stir until attacked. Then, like a wounded beast, she lashes out with sorrow and fury. Her tentacles whip through the air, her massive form slams against the stone. Her vestigial wings propel her forward with terrifying force. She doesn't merely strike at you. She tears at the fabric of reality itself. Cosmic energies rupture the air, beams of pure destruction lancing through the chamber, thinning the veil between Yharnam and the nightmare realms beyond. The battle is brutal. Like most boss fights, I know it's pretty popular these days to disparage Bloodborne's boss roster, but I really love them for being a good level of tough but manageable. Either way, ultimately, the player prevails, as they always must. Ebrietas falls, and with her death, silence falls. There is no revelation, no reward here. No great unveiling of secrets, only the knowledge that the source of Yharnam's corruption is gone. And yet the blood she gave, the blood that cursed this city, still lingers in the veins of its people. The nightmare is already set in motion. There is no undoing it now. Bloodborne's Blood Vials system has been debated a lot over the years, but personally I think it's one of the smartest thematic shifts from the Estus Flask of Dark Souls, at least in the early game. Unlike Estus, which is a carefully rationed, self-replenishing resource, blood vials have to be scavenged, looted or farmed from the beastmen you cut down in the streets of Yharnam. That alone, I think, reinforces Bloodborne's core identity. You're not some noble undead on a grand quest. You're a hunter, a predator, surviving by the blade and by the blood. It's a system that forces you into a constant, aggressive combat. Exactly the kind of mindset the game wants you in. The fact that blood vials are a finite resource only adds to this tension. You're always teetering on the edge, knowing that every vial you use is one less in your stash, pushing you to fight harder, faster, more efficiently. And then there's the lore entwinement. Bloodborne is the root of Yharnam's curse, its addiction twisting people into monsters. And the game doesn't just tell you that, it makes you feel it. You rely on the blood, hoard it, crave it, drench yourself in it. Before you know it, you're just as bound to it as the beasts you're hunting. Mechanically, it also helps new players, forcing them to engage with enemies, learn the rhythm of combat, and stock up on blood echoes to level up. That said, I do think the system could have evolved more in the late game. By the time you've beaten Ebrietas, farming vials feels more like a chore than a necessity. She's the source of the corrupted blood, so why not let her drop something to change the system? Maybe call it the Heart of Ebrietas or something like that. A relic that grants a rechargeable healing resource, like an upgraded Estus flask, restoring charges when resting at a lamp. It could offer stronger healing as a reward for making it that far, replacing the grindy aspect of vial farming while staying thematically fitting. I love the way blood vials define the Bloodborne experience, but I think a mid to late game evolution could have made them even better, preserving the thematic weight early on while smoothing out the gameplay in the later stretches. While we're looking at the sins of the Healing Church, it's time to grab a hold of our eye of a blood-drunk hunter and delve into the past. A DeLorean traveling 88 miles per hour this ain't. Here be monsters. To spill too much blood is to invite damnation. This is the fate of all hunters. The hunt is not merely a battle against beasts, it is a cycle, a curse. Those who drink too deeply of the blood, who revel too freely in the slaughter, find themselves ensnared in a prison of memory. A hunter who goes drunk with blood is said to be taken by the nightmare, destined to wander forever, engaged in an endless hunt. It is a fate that no hunter can escape. Those blood-drunk hunters awaken in the hunter's nightmare, an echo of Yharnam. The great avenues of the cathedral ward are here, but they are in some way wrong, distorted, decayed, as though built from fractured recollections rather than stone and mortar. The sky is sick with ruin, and where the pale moon should hang, there is only an eye. Its pupil is collapsed and turned to mush. The eye of a blood-drunk hunter, watching eternally. This is the graveyard of the past. Here the first hunters still roam, lost to their unending thirst for blood. They're not men. Not anymore. They are beasts in human skin, tearing through lesser creatures in a ceaseless, mindless hunt. Their weapons are older, cruder, heavier than you recognize. Built for brute force rather than elegance. And as the player moves through this waking nightmare, they realize these are their predecessors. The first hunters. The ones who came before. And they are no longer men. At the heart of the first layer of this nightmare, beneath the streets slick with blood and the cries of slaughter, there is something older. A corpse pile. A mountain of bodies fused together in a macabre, endless heap, bathed in the crimson river of the hunt's unrelenting carnage. And within that carnal abyss, there is movement. From the darkness a beast lumbers forward on too many legs. Part wolf, part horse. All nightmare. Its eyes glow with the madness of the hunt. One of its gaping maws, a jagged void lined with rows upon rows of glistening teeth. The other lined with eyes. This isn't a mindless beast or one of the lesser Scourgeborn. This is Ludwig, the Holy Blade. Ludwig, the Accursed. Once, like his noble hunters, he was a man, a leader, a warrior, a legend. He was the first true hunter of the Healing Church, the progenitor of the hunters that followed, a visionary. He sought to unite the people of Yharnam against the Scourge, to train men and women in the arts of the hunt so that they might purge the cursed from their midst. All for the Healing Church, which could never admit its sins. Ludwig was their champion, their sword and shield, but even he was not immune to the curse. No hunter is. In time, he too succumbed to the addictive power of the blood. Transformed into something monstrous, something neither man nor beast, Ludwig became trapped in the nightmare, as all others must. Lost, he wandered the underground corpse pile, slaughtering anything in his path, his mind broken beyond recognition. The blood of his victims pooled around him, flowing through the nightmare like a river, staining everything it touched. The battle against Ludwig is unlike any other in the game. He is a force of pure savagery, a relentless storm of fury and death. He does not simply attack, he crushes, rends, devours. His movements are unpredictable and wild, his many limbs clawing and trampling in a relentless pursuit of slaughter. There is no respite, no room to breathe. This is the hunt, in its purest, most terrifying form. And then, when the beast has spent its rage, when the bloodlust has waned, when the last shreds of his human soul flicker like embers in the dark, he finds something. His sword. A great blade, a thing of celestial might. Discovered in the days before his fall, he once looked upon it for guidance, whispering prayers to the tiny beings of light that surrounded it, emptying his fear into its hilt. Even now it remembers him, and for a moment, just a moment, the beast remembers itself. Ludwig rises, standing straighter. His ruined form shifts, becoming something else, something almost regal. A centaur-like fusion of man and monstrosity, he grips his blade once more, and for the first time in an eternity, he fights as a knight, as a hunter. But it is too late. He has been lost to the nightmare for too long. There is no redemption here, only death. As he falls, as the life fades from his monstrous eyes, he speaks with us one last time. His voice is not a snarl, nor a roar, nor a guttural scream. It is something softer, something fragile, something human. He asks of you,
"Are my church hunters the honorable Spartans? I hoped they would be."
There is no true answer, regardless of your choice. Do you offer him cold comfort in his final moments, allowing this old sentinel to believe in the righteousness of the cause he dedicated himself to? Or do you dispel his illusions and allow him to wallow in his denigration as he takes those final, raspy breaths? Perhaps, in the end, it doesn't matter. Ludwig's death allows the player to press onward, a layer deeper into the nightmare. Beyond him lies the research hall, the hidden heart of the Healing Church's darkest sins. But here, amidst the blood and the ruin, Ludwig's story ends. A hero, a monster, a hunter lost to the hunt. His final battle has been fought, and now his torment has ended. Beyond the corpse pile horrors of the underground, past the blood-soaked tomb of Ludwig, lies the research hall. A broken monolith of knowledge, this hidden facility, this monument to human ambition was the healing church's attempt to bridge the gap between man and God. It was here that scholars, in their ceaseless pursuit of transcendence, performed their horrific experiments. Here, innocent people were taken, snatched from their homes, from their beds, from their lives, and subjected to terrors in the name of progress. Ascending the research hall is like walking through a madhouse built on the bones of a university. Part prison, part lab, part place of learning. The structure spirals endlessly, its interconnected layers winding ever upward, drawing the player deeper into the church's sins. The level design is so good here. I still don't think it's been matched, really, in From's later games. The walls are lined with jars of viscera and half-born abominations, their true contents unknowable. Rusted surgical tools lie abandoned, stained with the blood of those who never left. The atmosphere here is so wonderful. It's almost like the air itself is thick with the residue of antiseptic, decay, of something salt-stung and distant, like the echoes of a drowned city. The level design of the research hall is, as I say, some of my favourite across From's catalogue. Interconnected, intertwined, constantly ascending and finding shortcuts. Moving the staircase's position changes the level design completely. It's simple and elegant and ingenious. It actually reminds me of the ideas first displayed in the crystal-lined halls of Seath's library from the original Dark Souls, perfected here in Bloodborne. And as you ascend, you are assaulted by one of the more horrific enemy designs in the game. The clock tower patients are what remains of the church's early failures. Once human, now something else entirely, their forms have been warped beyond recognition. Their heads, bloated, amorphous, filled with rising, translucent brain fluid, are obscene parodies of wisdom. Their arms, stretched and emaciated, claw uselessly at the air, as if grasping for something unseen. They wear the remnants of medical tunics or straitjackets, their bodies restrained by old leather straps, though whether these were meant to protect them or prevent their escape is unclear. They were meant to hear the voice of the cosmos. They were made to imbibe water, believing it would bring them closer to the Great Ones, and in their minds, torn open by trepanation, injected with fluids, they did hear something. The sound of waves. The whisper of something vast and dreaming. Their suffering was endless. And when the agony became too great, when their bodies could no longer sustain the weight of their mutation, the brain fluid inside them pulsed, alive and alien, until it became all that they were. A pile of mush. Their existence is proof of the Church's folly, and yet they are not the only ones. At the summit of the research hall, just outside in the Lumenflower Garden, wander the living failures. Shambling, malformed entities, they are the tragic precursors to the celestial emissaries, the ones that we met back in Upper Cathedral Ward. Proof that the Church sought not only to understand the Great Ones, but maybe to become them. These creatures, veined with unnatural luminescence, are both pathetic and terrifying in their blind, childlike rage. They are incomplete. They are unfinished. And yet, even in their failure, they fight with a purpose. They try to call to the divine. They fall like all the rest. Beyond those living failures, the astral clock tower looms. A structure of staggering grandeur, its silhouette is unmistakably reminiscent of London's Big Ben, but in this nightmare world, its chimes mark only the passage of damnation. Inside, in a modest wooden chair, sits a familiar figure. In stillness, her head tilted downward, her blood pooling beneath her. She should be dead. She wants to be dead, yet when the hunter reaches for her, she stirs all the same. Her voice, when she speaks, is tired and hollow.
A corpse should be left well alone.
Then she rises. Once Lady Matyr of the Astral Clock Tower was among the greatest hunters. A disciple of Gehrman himself, she wielded her twin-bladed rakuyo with unparalleled grace. Unlike her Cainhurst kin, who reveled in the corruption of heretical blood magic, Matyr chose a different path. One of skill and precision, not indulgence, but she could not escape her past. She had been there, at the Fishing Hamlet. She had taken part in the disturbing experiments in the research halls. She had tried and failed to offer comfort to the doomed. She had seen the original villagers warped, deformed, touched by something beyond human comprehension. She had participated in their massacre. She too had violated the corpse of Kos, the great one who had washed ashore. And in the wake of all that horror, her resolve shattered. Matyr cast aside her blade. She could no longer stomach the hunt. She could no longer face what she had done. It is implied, though I guess never explicitly stated, that she took her own life, hoping for absolution in death. But there was no escape. The nightmare claimed her. It held her here, in the Astral Clock Tower, as its guardian, as the keeper of its darkest, first secret. The fight against Lady Matyr is one of the most ferocious and elegant battles in the game. At first, she fights with the pristine, balletic grace of a master duelist, wielding her rakuyo in a flurry of deadly precision. Her attacks are fluid, unrelenting, each strike a dance, each movement a whisper of Cainhurst's lost nobility. But as the battle rages on, something changes. She is pushed too far, perhaps. She relents. And in a moment of desperation, she embraces the power she had forsaken. The blood magic of Cainhurst erupts from her. Her blade, once an extension of her skill, is now a conduit of crimson death. With each swing, blood splashes in great arcs. She lunges, twists, strikes, moving faster than before, more reckless, more desperate. She is fighting not just to stop the hunter, she is fighting to keep the past buried. But of course, it is futile. No matter how fiercely she clings to her duty, to her guilt, to her suffering and shame, the hunter will not falter, and in the end, Lady Matyr falls. As she lies on the cold wooden floor, the blood of the past pooling around her once more, there is no malice in her final moments, only relief, only release. The door to the cursed hamlet, hidden in that great clock, opens. Beyond Matyr, the truth awaits, the place where it all began, the place where humans first encountered a great one, the place where the orphan of Kos awaits. The Hunter's Nightmare has all been building to this, the final descent into the final, deepest layer of the nightmare. A place forgotten by time, unseen by the waking world, the Fishing Hamlet. A modest place, it is a world suspended in limbo. Nature, an unstoppable force, lays claim to the hamlet. Barnacle-encrusted huts, sunken pathways, seawater sloshing between rotten wooden planks and the crumbling stone of broken dwellings. Water leaks through the cracks of the world, flooding the land, seeping into the walls, reclaiming this place for the sea. Ghostly masts, splintered and skeletal, pierce the mist-drenched sea, their tattered sails fluttering like shrouds over a vast and unmarked grave at the village's edge. But the true horror is not in the ruins, it is in the people who remain. The hamlet's people were once human. Now, their bodies have been claimed by the ocean, their flesh altered by some foreign power. Scales, tendrils, and barnacles mar their skin. Their limbs have become bizarre amalgamations of fish and man, their faces half melded with the abyssal horrors of the deep. They do not speak much, but they pray. They pray for mercy for the poor wizened child. They kneel before the ruined homes, hands clasped, whispering prayers to Kos, the Great One, the Great Mother who washed ashore. They gather the parasites of Kos, collecting them in barrels, burning them for fuel, eating them to both sustain and further corrupt themselves. The hamlet lives in the shadow of a god's corpse, feeding off its decay, finding faith in its memory. They do not forget, and they do not forgive. For it was here in this cursed place that the hunters came. The memory of the hunters animates these fishermen into violent action against the player as they arrive in this coastal town. Long ago, the healing church heard rumor of an otherworldly being washed up on a lonesome seashore, and they sought to unravel the mysteries of the cosmos, to bridge the gap between humanity and the Great Ones. They turned to Byrgenwerth, to the scholars, to the hunters, those who would do what must be done. And so, all of these forces bore down on this small hamlet in search of proof of the divine, for in this place a Great One had come to rest. Kos, or some say Cosm, a being beyond human comprehension, had washed up on the shore dead, its form pregnant, its body unique. The imagery is that of a beached whale. Within its rotting womb the scholars found two things. Strange creatures clinging to Kos's flesh, the harbingers of mutation, the key to something greater, something to be studied, and a child. That wizened orphan, an infant Great One left behind in the belly of its mother. The specifics of what the scholars and hunters did to Kos is uncertain, but we do know that it was sacrilege. The hamlet was torn apart, its people slaughtered, its god defiled, and from that crime, the curse, the hunter's nightmare, was born. Kos, even in death, or what passes as death to an eternal ageless Great One anyway, cursed those who had wronged her, those who had touched her remains, those who had harmed her child. The curse seeped into the blood of the hunters, binding them to the nightmare, a purgatory of eternal torment for those who sought thrill in the hunt. The hamlet too was dragged into the nightmare, locked in time, its sorrow made eternal. And at the end of it all, at the final threshold of the nightmare, where the sky and the sea meet, lies the beach. There, at last, the player finds Kos. Her body ruined, rotting, resting on the shore where she was abandoned. Her corpse is fused with the sands, ripped and mutilated, the sea lapping at her in her stillborn reverence. Above, a yellow moon, not a celestial body, but that rancid eye, gazing down on the forsaken land. And before the corpse, standing in the shallow water, staring silently at the sky, the orphan. It does not acknowledge the player at first, instead it looks upward, as if searching for something beyond the nightmare, a presence long gone, a mother that will never return. As the hunter steps forward to approach the miracle child, it turns, and it screams. Wails like a newborn seeking comfort but finding none. The orphan of Kos is the ultimate test, by far the hardest encounter in the game, at least for me. A skeletal, emaciated figure, its flesh taut and sickly, its mouth twisted into a permanent rictus grin. A thin membrane drapes its back, an imitation of wings, mocking the celestial grace of its kind. It wields its own placenta, a gruesome final tie to its mother, and the only means it can find to protect itself as she once did. An umbilical weapon, still slick with afterbirth, used as a club, a flail, a glaive. The orphan is rage and sorrow given form. It fights like no other. It screams without end, a child trying to catch its first breath, It is relentless, merciless, its movements erratic and unnatural, a creature trapped between human and Great One, its very existence a contradiction and a violation. It is a battle against the pinnacle of the hunt, a battle against the grief of a god, and when the orphan falls, when it is slain, something remains. A phantom, a black shade lingering near the corpse of Cos, a spectre of the true orphan trapped in limbo. Only by striking it down does the nightmare truly end. With the orphan's death, the curse is lifted. The voice of Cos, perhaps a whisper from beyond, utters a final blessing.
Sweet child of Cos, returned to the ocean. A bottomless curse, a bottomless sea, accepting of all that there is and can be.
And with that, the nightmare fades. As we explored earlier, the slaying of Rom, the vacuous spider, is not really a victory. It is a mistake. The moment Rom dies, so too does that last illusion of Yharnam. The veil is gone and the truth is revealed. The sky splits open, the blood moon drowns the city in its scarlet glow, and with its arrival the fragile boundary between the waking world and the other is shattered beyond repair. In an instant, Yahar'gul, once a hidden domain of forbidden knowledge, awakens, but the city is not alive. Not in the traditional sense, anyway. It is a mass grave, a monument to failure. The population is gone, their bodies not merely dead, but petrified mid-scream, their limbs reaching in silent, eternal agony. They have been consumed by a ritual, a catastrophic experiment conducted by the school of Mensis in a desperate attempt to force humanity's next evolution. Like Byrgenwerth in the choir, the scholars of Mensis sought to transcend the limits of human existence. They believed that eyes on the inside, insight, beyond comprehension would lead to divinity. They abandoned reason. They abandoned morality. The entire population of Yahar'gul was fed to the nightmare, their souls ripped from their bodies, their flesh discarded like a failed experiment. The streets became a burial ground of the damned, arches, hallways and doorways lined with fused, screaming corpses, their final moments frozen in stone effigies of terror. And yet, the ritual worked, in part. The scholars of Mensis succeeded in breaking through the veil. Their minds were pulled from their flesh, severed from reality and dragged into the nightmare of Mensis, where they would remain trapped, forever wandering in an endless dream of madness. But when they left, something took their place. With the school of Mensis gone, something ancient stirred beneath Yahar'gul. The Fumarians emerged from the shadows. They had been waiting. Their bell-ringing women called the dead, their chants awakening horrors from the corpses that litter the streets. The slain are revived, their bodies stitched into new forms, deformed into ghastly hymns of flesh. But they do not act without purpose. They continue the ritual. They finish what the scholars of Mensis began, and at the heart of it all, they build a god. At Advent Plaza, the nightmare reaches its crescendo. The bells toll, the skies churn, and from the heavens a monstrosity descends, the one reborn. It does not crawl from the abyss, it is cast down. It is a fusion of the dead, a pale, bloated amalgamation of discarded human bodies, fused together into a single mass of rotting, writhing flesh. It has no real shape, no mind, only hunger. Atop the mound, a singular humanoid form lurches forward, its movements erratic, as if struggling to control the mass beneath it. But there is no true will behind it. no consciousness. This thing, this failure, is the final product of Yahar Ghul. This was, I think, meant to be a vessel, an earthly form for a great one. Was it meant for Murgo specifically? Was it for another unborn entity, one meant to rise beneath the blood moon? Or was it merely a perversion of godhood, the product of desperation created from madness and failure? Were the scholars of Mensis trying to produce their own god? I suppose it doesn't really matter. The hunter puts it down anyway. And in that moment, the final echoes of Yahar Ghul's ritual die. With the one reborn destroyed, the ritual is disrupted, and its scars remain. Beyond Yahar Ghul and the plaza, beyond the ruined experiment and the failures of mortals, in a secluded chamber, the remnants of the school of Mensis lie in wait. Their bodies are still here. Their minds are not. Seated in a circle, their heads locked in iron cages, they face their leader, a scholar, unmoving and untouched by time. Then a shift, a pull. The hunter is dragged from reality, ripped from the waking world and hurled into the nightmare. A prison, a dream built from the minds of those who reached too far. The nightmare of Mensis. And here Mikolash, host of the nightmare, waits. To seek an audience with the Great Ones is to abandon the self. To transcend humanity is to willingly drown in an ocean of unknowable horror. When Mikolash and the school of Mensis gazed too far, they found something waiting in the dark. And it didn't let them go. The hunter's arrival in the nightmare of Mensis is a descent into a realm that should not really exist. A place outside of time where reality is fractured, looping and deteriorating. It is a world sculpted by the thoughts of a dead man dreaming, shaped by Mikolash's mind, his memories, his unfulfilled desires. At its heart, it resembles an enormous ruined castle, a warped reflection of Byrgenwerth perhaps. But beyond its walls the land screams. The remains of those sacrificed in Mensis's grand ritual are scattered throughout, a forest of petrified corpses, mouths frozen in agony. These are the scholars of Mensis, the same fate that claimed the citizens of Yahar Ghul, their bodies used to make up the very fabric of the nightmare. Yet the worst horror is not what the scholars left behind, it is what they discovered. Suspended above the nightmare's ruined bridges, an impossible, rotting mass of eyes looms, a mind that sees all, but understands nothing. The brain of Mensis. The school sought enlightenment, and in their search they found this. A great one, lined with the coveted eyes on the inside, and some on the outside too, worshipped as a key to evolution. But I don't think its wisdom was meant for mortals. Its gaze alone seems to be death. Those who fall beneath its sights are driven into frenzy. An affliction so violent it bursts blood vessels, splinters the mind and leaves nothing but a corpse with shuttered eyes. The scholars left it here to study, believing it held the secret to ascension, but the only lesson it offered was madness. Every time I run through this area, I make a point of severing this thing's tether, pulling that lever and casting it into the abyss below, and when you yourself descend into that abyss, you find it helpless, lying in the dark, its once lethal gaze now nothing but a pitiful stare. Even a great one can die in the nightmare. So with the brain slain, the hunter climbs the castle. High in the loft, the host of the nightmare wanders a library without purpose, trapped in a loop of his own making. Mikolash. Once a scholar, now a mockery of knowledge, he does not fight, only runs, his voice echoing in ecstatic madness. He is a man lost in time, unaware of how long he has been here. He does not even recognize his own death approaching. But enough with the fancy language. Basically, Micolash runs away for most of the boss fight. He's incredibly annoying to fight. The first time, he's pretty interesting as a gimmick boss. Repeat playthroughs, not so much. When you finally have him cornered, he flails with his fists and feeble arcane attacks. He's no warrior, only a desperate scholar clinging to a dream that never came true. And as he dies, he does not rage, he does not weep. Micolash assumed that death would not be an end but an escape. How wrong he would be. At the top of the Nightmare Castle, the hunter finds the source of it all, and the thing that they were sent to find all along. Murgo. An unseen infant, a great one born of the Pthumerian Queen Yharnam, cradled in the unseen arms of its protector, Murgo's wet nurse. A towering, hooded figure, its 6 skeletal arms clutching curved blades, its wings blackened and tattered. It does not speak, it does not mourn, it only kills. A silent, eternal guardian. It moves without sound, warping the very air around it, duplicating itself into a swirling storm of slashing blades. It is neither human nor beast. Something that the hunter can't comprehend. A being bound to its duty even as the nightmare decays around it. But when it falls, a surprisingly easy task, the dream begins to crumble. Murgo, still unseen, whimpers and cries. And then, silence. The words appear. Nightmare slain. Earlier in the video, much earlier, we explored the masculine horror woven into Bloodborne's opening act. The brutality of the hunt, the raw bestial curse that consumes Yharnam. But as the game progresses, a shift has occurred. The second half pivots away from the savage and the bestial, moving instead into the realm of the cosmic, the divine, the feminine. Through figures like Queen Yharnam and Ariana, and through themes of childbirth, motherhood, and the ever-turning cycles of the moon, Bloodborne trades the horror of the physical for something more eldritch, more unknowable, yet just as terrifying. Bloodborne is a game that, for me, masterfully distorts traditional themes of motherhood, blood, and birth, turning them into sources of existential dread. In most stories, these elements are tied to life, creation, and nurture, but Bloodborne takes those familiar symbols and mutates them into horror. It's not the first work of horror to do something like this. Alien is the obvious example, merging body horror with the terror of motherhood, showing us how something so natural can be made horrifying. But Bloodborne, I think, pushes us further. Through its world building, the enemy design and lore, it explores the dark side of procreation and transformation, revealing a nightmarish vision of existence where birth is an abomination, blood is a curse, and motherhood is a cruel trap. In most traditions, blood carries an intrinsic duality. It's the essence of vitality, but also a harbinger of death. It can sanctify and defile in equal measure. Bloodborne's narrative takes that ambiguity and weaponizes it. As we've explored at length by this point, the Healing Church, the dominant religious institution in Yharnam, reveres blood as a sacred, miraculous substance. But this worship, as we know, is a lie. Their blood doesn't heal, it infects. It transforms, it spreads the plague of the beast, mutating people into mindless monsters. The closer they get to divinity, the less human they become. This inversion aligns perfectly with Lovecraftian horror, where seeking knowledge, power, or transcendence leads only to madness. In Bloodborne, blood is a vector of contamination, not salvation. Instead of granting enlightenment, it induces violent devolution. It reveals that the price of power is the loss of self, that the pursuit of understanding leads not to clarity, but to horror. The deeper you drink, the less of you remains. Nowhere is the fear of feminine power more evident than in the Vilebloods, a vampiric aristocracy ruled by Queen Annalise. The Healing Church vilifies them, portraying their blood rituals as heretical and dangerous. But beneath this condemnation lies a deeper, more historical anxiety, the fear of women who do not conform to patriarchal structures. The Vilebloods, with their seductive immortal queen, mirror real-world depictions of female figures who wield control over life and death. From the blood-drinking Lamia of Greek mythology to real-world Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess of Hungary, history has demonized powerful women by associating them with vampirism, excess, and corruption. Bloodborne draws upon these cultural fears, making Annalise both alluring and monstrous, a woman whose blood grants immortality but defies the authority of the Church. As a very quick aside, and I'm not going to get too derailed into it I hope, but the case of Elizabeth Bathory is particularly fascinating. She is often depicted as one of history's most infamous female monsters, accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of young women to bathe in their blood, believing it would grant her eternal youth. Yet, many historians have come around to the idea that maybe these accusations were fabricated or exaggerated, the product of political maneuvering by powerful men who sought to dismantle her influence and seize her estate, particularly in the wake of her husband's death. The story of Bathory mirrors a pattern in history where powerful, independent women were framed as unnatural, their ambitions rebranded as monstrous excesses. In Bloodborne, the Vilebloods and Queen Annalise suffer a similar fate, branded as unnatural, reviled as blood drinkers and systematically persecuted by the male-dominated Healing Church. The game taps into this historical pattern, reinforcing the idea that female power, when unchecked, is something to be feared and destroyed. In Bloodborne, childbirth is not a process of creation, but an event of cosmic horror. The game is full of monstrous births, veiled attempts at divinity, and perversions of reproduction. Ariana and Queen Yharnam are the most obvious examples of this theme. Both women become unwilling vessels for Great One offspring. Ariana, after an implied encounter with an unearthly being, I assume Uden, gives birth to a horrific, writhing slug creature. An inversion of the joy of childbirth into something monstrous and profane. Queen Yharnam, eternally mourning the loss of her own Great One child, haunts the game as a tragic spectre, seen first at that lake with Rom, and then later in the Nightmare. Here, I think quite powerfully, Bloodborne taps into real-world anxieties surrounding pregnancy and childbirth. Tocophobia, or the fear of pregnancy, manifests as tangible horror in Yharnam. Childbirth is depicted as a parasitic, alien invasion, a process that irrevocably alters the body and the mind, often against the will of the mother. For much of human history, childbirth was a dangerous, unpredictable process, one that could kill the mother, the child, or both. It is a power beyond control, indifferent to the desires of those involved. At the end here, even the game's bosses reflect this warped take on motherhood. Murgo's wet nurse serves as a macabre inversion of the ideal maternal care. Its presence is not comforting, it's menacing. At its core, Bloodborne's narrative, particularly in the second half, is about how the most fundamental aspects of life, blood, birth, and motherhood, can be transformed into sources of terror. In Yharnam, to give birth is to usher in horror. To seek enlightenment is to invite corruption. The act of creation is not a blessing, but a curse.
I knew it. I'm different. I'm no beast. Oh, God, it feels awful. But it proves that I'm chosen.
With the nightmare slain and the hunter free to return to the waking world, their quest is over, right? Yharnam is saved. And yet, the knight has one final question to ask. But just before we get into the end game of Bloodborne, I think now is a good time to clarify what the dreams and nightmares really are. Feel free to skip ahead to part 5 if this doesn't interest you. The dreams and nightmares in Bloodborne aren't just dreams in the traditional sense. They're real physical places, existing on alternate planes of reality, tied to the consciousness of specific Great Ones. The Hunter's Dream was created by the Moon Presence. Somebody we'll meet in a minute, with Gehrman as its trapped host. Its purpose? To keep hunters stuck in an endless cycle, unable to die for good until the Moon Presence gets what it wants. The death of Murgo, a rival newborn Great One. Or at least maybe that's what it wants from you specifically. Who knows how many countless others are under its thrall. At least one ending implies that all of this is just one permutation of the Moon Presence's greater work. The dream came into existence when Lawrence, or maybe just Gehrman alone, used an umbilical cord to summon the Moon Presence. The cord, found in the Hunter's Workshop, reads, "The third umbilical cord precipitated the encounter with the pale moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the hunter's dream." The dream itself is a reflection of Gehrman's old workshop in the waking world, but his role as host is never fully explained. What I think is clear is that his imprisonment spares him from the hunter's nightmare. The Moon Presence's hold on him overrides Cos's wrath. That doesn't necessarily mean he's at peace, though. Gehrman sees the dream as its own kind of hell, and the torment of the nightmare still haunts him. That's why, after the orphan is defeated and the nightmare ends, Gehrman can finally sleep soundly. Speaking of the hunter's nightmare, it exists as a cosmic punishment. We've explored this a little bit at length. I think it was created by Cos to torment Gehrman, Maria, and everyone responsible for the Hamlet massacre. It's not just a purgatory for hunters, though. It's a prison for all who descended from Byrgenwerth, including church ministers like Lawrence. As we saw earlier, Cos's vengeance was so strong she literally willed an entire reality into existence just to make them suffer. Curse the fiends, their children too, and their children forever true. Who exactly acts as the host of this nightmare isn't entirely clear, at least to me. It could be the orphan, I suppose, or maybe even Maria, but either way, the nightmare has trapped countless minds within it. It's a twisted reflection of past events, places, and people, all frozen in torment as a reminder of the horrors they committed. And a pretty useful way to exposit dialogue onto the player. The Nightmare Frontier is, I think, supposed to be a warped reflection of Loran, another lost civilization that, like Yharnam, fell to the beast curse. The enemies, the landscape, and the fact that Amygdala drops the Loran chalice all hint at a connection at least. Delving into that chalice dungeon gives you a sandy, desert-themed dungeon to explore, so I assume at least it's some far-off land. Speaking of which, let's talk about chalice dungeons for a second. I haven't really covered them, and honestly, that's because most of them just aren't really worth talking about. They're pretty tedious, repetitive, and poorly balanced, with way too many layers between you and the Queen Yharnam boss fight. Sure, they have some pretty cool, unique enemies and bosses, plus the high-powered blood gems that boost your weapons. And lore-wise, they do confirm that places like Loran and Ys went through all this madness before, but overall, just not that engaging. I got the platinum, and that was more than enough of the Chalice dungeons for one lifetime. Anyway, back to the Nightmare Frontier. Along with the Nightmare of Mensis, which you can actually see in the distance, this realm was discovered by Byrgenwerth, or maybe Mensis scholars, probably by accident. At some point, their entire lecture hall got sucked into the Nightmare, which is why you find it floating here. The Mensis scholars were trying to commune with a Great One, using an umbilical cord from Murgo. But instead of enlightenment, their ritual fried their minds. Hence, I think the description on Murgo's cord you get after silencing the newborn Great One. This cord granted Mensis audience with Murgo, but resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. Which explains why so many of them are just dead when you find them in Yahar'gul. The player, by uniting the cords, by which I mean, of course, eating them, is granted insight that no other being has ever been able to, giving you a chance at something more. Speaking of which, beneath the shadow of a great tree, in a meadow of pale flowers, swaying under the glow of the soft moonlight, the hunter stands before German, the first hunter. The nightmare is over, the beast scourge ended, and now, at last, German waits with an offer.
The night is near its end. Now, I will show you mercy. You will die, forget the dream, and awake under the morning sun. You will be freed from this terrible hunter's dream.
His words are kind, almost fatherly, but in his hands the burial blade is waiting. The choice he offers is final, without malice or cruelty, a swift, clean end to a cycle of bloodshed and torment. If the hunter kneels, if they surrender to the old hunter's mercy, the blade will fall. The last thing they will see is the pale sky of the dream, the gentle drift of flower petals carried by the wind, and then nothing. They awaken. The sun rises over Yharnam, golden and warm. The horrors of the night are gone, lost to the realm of forgotten dreams. The hunt is over. Perhaps this is the best ending. A quiet return to ignorance, a rejection of the pursuit that doomed so many before. Byrgenwerth, the choir, the school of Mensis, all sought the unknowable and were destroyed by it. Perhaps by choosing to walk away, the hunter learns what none of them could. To leave well enough alone and not interfere with powers greater than themselves. They never found the pale blood, and perhaps that is for the best. To submit is to let the nightmare die, to trust in the coming dawn, to hope. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream. And yet, is this truly an escape? The question lingers, it gnaws. Is this simply another form of surrender? Is ignorant surrender ever enough to be considered a victory?
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.
But the hunter may refuse. They may choose to fight. German does not rage, he doesn't plead, he only laughs. Slowly, he rises from his chair, standing tall for the first time, rolling his shoulders as though waking from a long slumber. His hands tighten around the burial blade.
It always comes down to the hunter's helper to clean up
What a cool animation. Then, with a cruel, knowing smile, he whispers,
Tonight, Gammon joins the hunt.
The battle against German is quick and brutal, the clash of two hunters at the peak of their powers and skill. In the end, German falls. His body slumps into the flowers, the burial blade slipping from his grasp. At last, he is free. And yet, something stirs. The sky splits, the moon so vast and swollen bleeds. A great shadow descends, shifting and coiling as though reality itself bends to its presence. It lands without sound, towering over the hunter, eyeless and pale. It does not ask. It doesn't speak. It simply claims its new servant. The hunter drops to their knees, body trembling, mind unraveling as something immense burrows into them. They do not resist. They can't resist. This was never German's dream to give. The Great One looms closer, its presence overwhelming, drowning the hunter in its endless will. They fall into darkness, consumed by something greater than thought and reason, and then they awaken. Not in Yharnam, and certainly not under the morning sun. They are still in the hunter's dream. German is gone, and we have taken his place, restarting the horrors of the hunt again. So, rejecting German's offer is an act of defiance, but I think it's also an act of the truest ignorance, the embracing of the bloodlust. The hunter, unaware of the true nature of the dream, refuses the mercy of death and instead chooses to fight. Perhaps they believe it is a test, one final challenge to overcome before they can awaken from this nightmare. But this is not a battle of liberation. Without consuming the third umbilical cords, without understanding the cosmic horror lurking behind the dream, the hunter is fighting blindly, unaware of the chains that bind them. German, bound to this reality for countless ages, has longed for release. His executioner's blade is not punishment. A final merciful stroke to sever the ties between the hunter and the dream, yet in rejecting it, the hunter unknowingly seals their own fate. When German falls, the sky darkens, and from the abyss descends the moon presence. The Great One that created the dream, the unseen puppeteer behind the cycle of endless hunts. What is the moon presence? What does it desire? Well, the Great Ones by their very nature are unfathomable. Their intentions are alien, their logic beyond human comprehension. Did it create the hunter's dream as a means to cultivate warriors? Are the hunters mere pawns in some futile struggle, foot soldiers in a silent war between godlike entities? Or is the dream a prison, an illusion of purpose designed to ensnare those who seek the truth? A feast for an insatiable entity. The game offers no real concrete answers, only fragments of insight that hint at something uncontrollable, something horrifyingly indifferent to human existence. But to the hunter who fights blindly, who fights purely for the blood-soaked victory, none of that matters. The moon presence embraces its new servant. The hunter, exhausted from battle, is powerless to resist. The god bends them to its will, and in a single moment the last vestiges of their free will dissolve. They awaken not to freedom, but to a new beginning, sitting in the same wheelchair where German once rested, staring out into the garden of white flowers. The doll stands beside them, offering quiet words of comfort, just as she did for the man they replaced. The cycle continues, the dream persists, and another hunt begins. Make no mistake, this is the truest failure. Quite possibly the darkest fate in any FromSoft game, at least until they introduce the Three Fingers and the loathsome Dung Eater in Elden Ring. The hunter's fate is not death, but endless servitude. an existence shackled to the will of one who thinks of them as a meaningless speck in this unfeeling cosmos. The game has long warned of this outcome, the bloodlust, the ceaseless battles, the growing madness. This world is one that feeds on violence, and those who indulge in it mindlessly are doomed to become its prisoners. Throughout the journey, the hunter has fought countless others who lost themselves to the hunt. Blood-drunk killers, forsaken warriors, hollowed-out hunters who exist only to slay their own kind, and now the hunter joins their ranks. The final lesson of Bloodborne is clear, I think. To embrace the hunt without question is to be consumed by it. But there is one last path. If the hunter has sought true insight, if they have glimpsed the hidden threads of the world, if they have gathered the scattered pieces of forgotten divinity, if they have consumed those 3/3 of umbilical cord, then they are no longer prey. The moon presence still descends, stretching its terrible maw toward the hunter, but something pushes back. The hunter does not kneel. They resist. For a moment, the Great One hesitates, and then, with a shriek that shatters the sky, it attacks. The final battle is not fought against beast or man, it is fought against the god that rules them all. And when the moon presence finally falls, something new is left behind. The hunter does not awaken, they do not rise. Instead, they change, and a great one is born. The doll kneels before it, cradling the newborn thing in her hands.
Are you cold? Oh, good hunter.
You have become something beyond reason, beyond humanity. But I mean, is this truly transcendence? Or is it just another form of horror? Another that we can't possibly begin to understand? If the game is shown as one thing consistently, I think it's this. The Great Ones are creatures of loss, forever mourning what they can never regain. They are gods of longing, drawn to empty cradles, to stillborn hopes, to the eternal cycle of tragedy and rebirth. The hunter is among them now, having achieved Willem's great work. Yusefka's cord reads, Provost Willem sought the cord in order to elevate his being and thoughts to those of a great one, by lining his brain with eyes, the only choice he knew if man were to ever match their greatness. So you're no longer a person, you're no longer yourself, you're a pale slug, writhing in the doll's hands, a thing without memory, a god without will, reliant on others. In the end, there is no true awakening, no escape. Only the dream, only the cycle, only the hunt. Thanks for watching. See you next time.